Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the second podcast from the Center of Intra-Muslim Studies, CIMS, where today I'm again joined by three prestigious guests. We have Professor Shabana from the American Islamic College in Chicago, Shaykh Hassan Rabbani from Glasgow, who works as a chaplain at the Harriet Watt University and also does a lot of cross-community work, and Professor Eman Abdelhadi, also from the University of Chicago. And today, leading on from our previous discussion, today we're talking about Muslim community and center context, managing diverse perspectives on sexuality. Now, in the Western world especially, we know that these topics are becoming increasingly topical and Muslim communities are being affected. Sometimes Muslim communities and Muslim individuals are feeling conflicted between their wider society and their own personal religious standpoints. With all of the complex issues that are covered within a theme of managing diverse perspectives on sexuality, Shaykh Hassan, I'm going to start with you and ask you, are Muslims in pastoral positions, be they chaplains, imams, chaplain as you are, a sheikh as you are with your traditional background from Al-Azhar as well, educators within traditional contexts, are they adequately equipped to manage these topics when they are approached by Muslims at grassroots level?
A little bit about myself. I think we are educated in the more fiqh perspective of things, that this is halal, this is haram, this is this is that, without forgetting the emotions and the person in front of us. I was very, very lucky and privileged that my university trained me up as a counselor and therapist, in particular in relationship, which led my work in Relationship Scotland, which I do now. And going through that journey for me, it was how to not unlearn the fiqh. How do you make the fiqh relevant to the emotions of actual people? And I think that was challenging and very difficult. So I think as imams and educators, our system, I think this goes back to pedagogy. Our system of Dars Nizami and Almiyat studies is not made to produce pastoral care workers or counselors.
And the Shia counterpoint in the Hawza system as well, the same issue.
And honestly, the journey from then through counseling is that how do I unlearn some of this stuff and make the fiqh very adaptable and actually very relevant. I can say a lot because I've been working in this field, and I don't know if I'm going to share too much.
Well, during the conversation of today, you will be saying a lot, I hope.
Actually, I have a question about that, if I may. I'm curious what process you went through. I'm also curious how that compares to other chaplains and how they approach that. For example, is there a real struggle, right, to adapt it? And is there sort of some pressure to not adapt, right, and to remain perhaps true to the more technical aspects of what your actual training was, right? And then what are the supports that allowed you to develop it, or were you really on your own?
It was very challenging in the sense I was the only brown person in my cohort being trained as a therapist for 2.5 years, but not just only the brown person, as an imam and sheikh who has very strong preconceived ideas on different types of sexuality, which I sadly couldn't air to the rest of the group because I'm so divorced from the cohort that I was actually with. So that was very, very challenging. I was very lucky to have a supervisor, a lovely Christian woman who gave me that space to talk about some of the stuff. And I felt because as a Christian, she also struggled with a lot of that. To the point where I was working with Muslim clients who had left Islam, had become gay now, and were coming in for therapy. And as a sheikh, I had to take that hat off, put on my therapy hat, and validate his feelings, be non-judgmental, and give him that space. And the question I was always asked by fellow imams, how on earth do you do that? And I think my justification was that he knows he's sitting with someone with a beard, and that in itself perhaps is very powerful for him, and to have that very empathetic kind of experience. And not only that, I think then he referred a couple of his friends. I've worked with white lesbian couples. So that counseling part actually has really challenged me, and I'm still kind of finding out. But I think for me, what's important was having a good supervisor that I can return back to and share a lot of things in that space.
Well, I can imagine in your journey of chaplaincy since you began until this point in 2024, these kind of issues being dealt with must have increased, perhaps exponentially during that period. And for Muslims, especially in diasporic contexts in Western societies, being influenced by the wider society, views change. And Eman, you were saying in your presentation yesterday, you were highlighting how there have been trends and perhaps shifts in opinions within Muslim societies in the USA towards, again, sexuality from diverse perspectives. Could you highlight some of those again, the more salient aspects of that research?
Yeah, so what I presented on yesterday was survey data from the Pew Research Center that was collected in 2007, 2011, and 2017. And what we see for Muslim Americans is that there's a big attitude shift. The question in the survey is, should society should homosexuality be accepted by society, or should it be discouraged by society? And in 2007, the majority of Muslims said it should be discouraged, like 60% to 30%, and then some who said they didn't answer. And then across the decade, that shifted such that the majority of American Muslims were saying it should be accepted by society. By 2017, it was well over a majority. And so I looked at to try to understand where that change is coming from. And a lot of it is coming from both, is a sort of generational change. And it's both people changing their minds. It seems that millennials, Gen Xers and millennials became more liberal on the issue over time. So Gen Xers who were interviewed in 2007 or 2011 were less likely than people of the same cohort in 2017 to be accepting. And then at the same time, it's also that Gen Z was aging into the survey, right? So the survey is only of people 18 and up. By 2017, you start to have some of Gen Z in there. And Gen Z is very liberal on this issue, very accepting of this issue. But what's also interesting is that when you look at the effect of religiosity, so if you look at all Muslims in the survey and you say, okay, are people who are likely to pray every day more accepting or less accepting? You would find that people who pray more are less accepting of homosexuality. But when you break that down by generation, you find that those who are for people raised in the US, religiosity doesn't actually play a big role. So the religious and the non-religious among people raised in the US have similar views on homosexuality. There's only kind of a slight religiosity effect. But for those who weren't raised in the US, for first-generation immigrants, especially those who came past the age of 15, there is a big religiosity difference. So for them, religiosity is a big determinant. So it's an interesting trend. I think that what we're seeing is that the community is moving towards more acceptance, it raises interesting questions.
But I want to kind of stop you there and push back a bit, because when you say moving towards acceptance, the question that seemed to be asked was about homosexuality in the wider society.
Yes.
What about when it hits home? And what about when we're talking about Muslims who are professing diverse perspectives on these kind of issues? And again, when you're on the pastoral front line, you must have had a first-hand experience, unlike pretty much anyone else around this table, in terms of these issues.
Yes, I think language is quite important. So the idea of general adab, care, and empathy. This is how I deal with it. sometimes my fiqh brain switches off and my counseling brain switches on. I think this is how I am dealing with it. And when my counseling brain switches on, it's about emotions, their feelings, how they understand, and I need to show care and compassion. But then when I switch back to my fiqh brain, it becomes very technical. How do we understand this issue? And I would probably say that, and perhaps some scholars would agree, where there has to be a change of wordings that perhaps need to be used. I think that's important in our context. And number three, I think I know scholars who are dealing with issue of homosexuality, for instance, within their own children, extended family, and now they're being pushed to reevaluate how do we begin to understand this and rephrase some of the fiqh. So those are some of the challenges, but I'm very lucky. I'm able to do this switch.
What guidance can you provide in terms of guidance? He wasn't a counselor as such, but as a religious person.
Yeah.
What does guidance mean in this case?
Yeah, true. Interesting. I mean, I would suggest there's a few Imams in the front line who are dealing with this, and I don't think so they need guidance. They have the emotional intelligence actually to deal with it. I think if you say to all Imams, I think that's very much of a push. I don't expect that, but there's certain Imams who are now beginning to deal with this, and I think they're able to understand the complexity of between the fiqh and the lived experience, and how do we straddle the both. I would perhaps say that the question is, from a fiqh perspective, is don't push someone where they're now willing to leave Islam because of this. That's like an added burden, what they're doing. But it's very difficult. And I think it's also difficult because it's politically loaded.
Indeed.
I think that's a further complexity to it. We faced this in Scotland because the First Minister, Hamza Yusuf, took a very a clear stance on one particular position, and there was a huge kind of backlash actually to that. And I think that hardens the lines, and that's fine. But people and Imams like me who are dealing with it, for us, again, it's a real experience. It's not about politics. It's not about these hardened lines and what's being pushed to us, but it's a real phenomena that we're actually dealing with.
You mentioned the political aspect of it, and the political loadedness of it makes it more complex. And for people of a religious standing, Shabana, how can we balance this? That a person in public life can hold their religious beliefs. Are we able to hold our religious beliefs? And at the same time, not be pushed out of these spaces. I mean, you teach a course on, that deals with a lot of these issues.
Yeah. I think it's really difficult. We are not free to have you have that conversation with your mentor. People can't have those conversations. They're pulled into the office. Like children are pulled into the office. Their children are referred to prevent for saying something about jihad or whatever else, right? And in that database for life, right? So it's very, very difficult then to process any of this very difficult stuff. And then again, we are particularized as Muslims. Muslims are not the only ones with different positions on sexuality. And it's really amazing that Muslims are constantly under that magnifying glass. But actually, if I could address another thing that you were talking about earlier in terms of chaplaincy, because we had a really good discussion in our group yesterday, where Sophie Gilliatt-Ray was leading, and we were talking about chaplaincy, and she mentioned how Muslim chaplains in many cases have to come up with the way she described it. I think I would describe it as like spiritual ER, right? And that you are as a chaplain, you're really accountable to this person who is in pain. You're not accountable to the Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah, whatever, like Hausa or something. Like you're not accountable to a scholarly body. And so you don't have to keep to those technical, you don't have to observe such faithfulness to the technical aspects of jurisprudence, right? What you do have to establish is care. And I found it very powerful when you spoke of care, compassion, and switching off, really, because that's what it is. Some people might see this as a like a difficult line, like almost a breaking, almost a rupture, but I don't see it that way. We do these things in our everyday life all the time, right? I switch on my mother's side, and then I switch off my academic. Like, we do this all the time in our everyday lives. So I find that very powerful as something that you do, and I wish there was more supportive structure for that, so that this isn't just something that you're doing on your own. Because I feel like that's, we were talking about this, and she was talking about, I said, why don't we create a website where you can put these things online, these case studies where chaplains came up with creative ways to not play with or like disrespect Islamic law, but to make them practicable for people who are in pain, people who are in jail, people who are patients in hospital, whatever, right? And to put them online and to make them available, because I feel like that could be a body of work that shifts the movement forward. I feel like the Islamic scholarly class it's difficult to move those discussions. I feel like there's like a level of like captivity.
We're going to come, sure. We're going to come back onto that point in just a minute, but yeah, go ahead.
Well, I wanted to talk more about this question of public life, because I think that we, in the UK, whether it's in the UK or in the US, we are a minority that our own presence is itself politicized, right? And it is often the case that our political enemies, and I'm very comfortable using that term, right? The people who want to ban us, the people who, literally mobilize Islamophobia for every campaign, are also the people who might share similar doctrinal position with a maybe substantial fragment of our community on this issue of sexuality. Yeah. And I think it becomes very important for us not to allow ourselves to be used in this way. We are not trying to legislate fiqh in the US or in the UK, right? In the US, we had this Navigating Differences letter that came out that, issued a kind of uniform view on homosexuality or homosexual acts in Islam, but also made a political statement about being willing to work with anyone who could protect the kids and such and such. And I think it just completely it empowered the Christian right. And in fact, people who know about the background of the document know that it was in collaboration with the Christian right. And it wasn't the only case, right, of Muslims kind of falling into this trap. But to go back to our conversation from earlier about picking and choosing, right? We're not legislating against usury, against interest, when our entire economy is full of it. Most of us have student loans that have interest-bearing loans. It's almost impossible to buy a house without interest, right? We're not legislating against alcohol. We don't believe in alcohol, but we don't legislate against it, right? Why is it that we are choosing this thing, right, in which to kind of enter the foray of the public, of legislating our beliefs in public? Now, so I think it's very important to kind of separate the politics. And that also allows our community to have a diversity of views. It allows respect for people who say, you know what, I actually really do believe in the traditional kind of fiqh position on this, without that implying support for the Christian right? I think that the truly kind of ecumenical position is to say, let's separate this from our political position in this country.
Anthropologically speaking, sorry, you mentioned a disparity between things that as Muslims we might see as problematic, alcohol, for example, consumption of alcohol, but we're not moving that way to ban it, etc. Yeah. Can we say that perhaps we don't have such a harsh attitude towards 3 and 4 because 1 and 2 are really up there in our priorities?
I mean, Dr. Matson mentioned yesterday, I mean, riba, usury is the thing that Allah is at war with, right? But again, I'm not going to wade into fiqh debates because that's not my place. But I will say that, I mean, there has been a kind of study of the Islamic period pre-colonialism. And while you have on the books very strict laws on, there's actually very little enforcement traditionally in Muslim history of laws against sexuality. So there's a difference, I think, traditionally in Muslim societies between what is verbatim in the books and what is actually enforced. I don't know I don't know where to take that, you know. And I think we can say, and I think actually, if someone were here that signed that letter, they might say, well, this is a different issue because the children are being exposed to it, and so our children are. And I think, frankly, in some ways they're right, because I will say right now, people under 18 in America, I think I've seen estimates from 30 to 50% identify as something other than straight, right? So your children are, if there's no reason to believe that Muslims are going to have a different percentage, right? And so the question, if your kids are in school and life, right, their friends are likely to have somebody who's queer as well. So I think, again, this comes back to this issue of like, the Pandora's box is already open. You're not going to put Pandora back in the box. I think I messed up that metaphor. I actually don't really know this myth. Or you're not going to get the horse back in. The point is, you can go back in time. Like, we're not going to be able to reverse these trends. Where do we go?
In that, to speak to that, you mentioned a few things that are discussed at a scholarly level.
Yeah.
And you teach those very things at a scholarly level. And the question is, but the effects of them or the lived experience of them are not just at the scholarly level, they're throughout society, including at the scholarly level and at the grassroots. Are those discussions that you have in your class at the college then transferable and translatable to the wider Muslim community?
Yeah. So in my class, when I teach sort of Islamic law, but I also talk about stories, the stories of women and, sexual minorities, etc. And I find that they are very useful, the stories particularly. When we speak about a scholarship, Islamic law, then it's a little, it's very political for people. That becomes like a place where they cannot move, right? Like, why are you criticizing Imam so and so, etc., right? But when you talk about, say, for example, if you're reading, I don't know, Woman at Point Zero, Nawal al-Saadawi's book, then, an Imam will read that book and say, wow, this woman went through a lot of problems and a lot of struggles, and what do I as an Imam have to give to her? Like, put on hijab? Like, what? That's not helpful. So you have to look at the holistic experience of a person. So I feel like certain modalities, certain strategies of pedagogy and conversation are more useful than others. Right? And I think that the stories, and this is why I do research, this is why I do interview ethnographic research, because the human story makes sense, right? But the text where a man from the 10th century says this must happen when he's living in those particular circumstances, that doesn't necessarily speak to people as much. And so then they're like twisting it around and trying to fit it into their lives, and it makes no sense, right? It makes no sense. It doesn't make sense. So they're like, there's something invalid about my life here in the West as a person living in 2024. Something is wrong. And that really just twists people up and creates all kinds of like toxic mixes in our lives and conflict with each other over words rather than actual life issues.
So these actual life issues, Shaykh Shabana mentioned, requires us to see the person as a whole. In a Muslim Islamic center, in a mosque, even if I see their actions as un-Islamic, if I do, and immoral, But whilst these other people, I can see them as a person who commits something which I don't agree with, and I can still stand next to them and pray. Why can I not do that with this particular issue?
I mean, I think the issue of drinking alcohol has perhaps been there longer, and maybe this is a new issue, and we just really do not actually know how to deal with it. Perhaps that's one thing. When I talk about the fiqh being creative, when it comes to alcohol, and usually it was interesting to see how the creative fiqh plays about. So the scholar said, okay, for one house, it's absolutely fine. We had scholars saying, is riba paper currency? Can you charge riba on that or not? I mean, there's classical fiqh positions when the currency changed to paper currency. Do we pay zakat on it or not? In the Hanafi fiqh, there's idea that riba is only on 4 or 5 categories: gold, silver, barley, wheat. Can that be extended to paper money? So you see fiqh really being very clever as selling alcohol. Well, Abu Hanifa's position was you can sell to non-Muslims and it's a void transaction. But the fiqh kind of developed with that. And I feel with the whole sexuality, with this argument, is the fiqh developing? I mean, I'm not saying should we or shouldn't we, but the idea it has done for other issues. I mean, I'm just opening up ideas here, but I'm just trying to say, the fiqh was very colorful and at play with other things. And I think because this is a relatively kind of new challenge that we're seeing, so I think it will develop. And I'd also like to say a couple of things that's linked to that Professor Eman said. The idea of our children are exposed to it, I think that's an issue that's been a layer of complexity that's been added to it. The issue of sexuality in accordance to immorality, I think that's a layered complexity. But if we strip down all of these complexities and understand, as an ummah now living in the West, we are going to have brothers and sisters who are going to be dealing with sexuality and gender issues genuinely, and forget all the politics. How do we offer a kind of insider, fiqh, authentic approach to them with care? I think that's what we need to be really thinking about.
So,
and I think that's partly about, I think part of the barrier to that is that a lot of Muslims, lay Muslims, have internalized these very Western labels of like liberal, conservative, such and such, and use them to determine the legitimacy of the various people who are trying to do any kind of ijtihad on this topic, right? Yeah. So instead of saying, this person has this idea, either I buy it or I don't, they're like, oh, I heard this Shaykh, this person, this Imam, said this one thing once, so he's one of those liberals, so we don't listen to him on anything anymore, right? And I think it's ironic because those same people recognize the need for ijtihad in creating an indigenous American Islam on other issues. But this issue, if there's any divergence, then you are labeled as like you're westernized, you're taking on this like outsider. It's similar to the feminism issue, right? Yeah. You've bought in, you've drank the Kool-Aid, you're a sellout, we're not going to listen to anything. So I think that we have to align with with what we're saying. We can't have this hypocrisy where we say, we need ijtihad, we need an indigenous American Islam, British Islam, unless you come out with this idea that I find threatening, even though I'm not a scholar, right? So the number of people who will say, I'm not a scholar, but you're wrong on this, right? Like, okay, it's one or the other. Like, Habibi, come on.
In your research, you spoke about changing attitudes with the wider community. Yeah. Were you able to look at how people who are within the Muslim community and expressing these kinds of tendencies, what spaces they were allowed with it, or were they completely ostracized, or what was happening there? Was there anything attitudes toward that when these complexities come into the community itself?
Yeah, I wouldn't say from this particular study, since it's just like a survey, but in my broader work, in my qualitative work, I think that and even anecdotally as a Muslim and as a member of the Muslim community, I think that there is this, I think for a lot of young religious folks, there's this kind of discomfort / I don't know, Allahu A'lam kind of thing about it, where it's like, if you're not gay yourself, like, you're going to be nice to your gay friends, and you're going to be chill. But like, if you're not gay yourself, you're like, thank God I don't have to deal with this. I don't have to come to a stance, you know. And I don't know if that answers your question you were asking me about particular spaces. And I think there are certain spaces that are billing themselves as these open spaces where you're not going to be asked, and you're not, you know, it's a sort of like don't ask, don't tell situation, which sometimes is honestly better than some of the other situations where, you know, and so.
Yeah, I do think there is a driving out force though from
Absolutely.
the communities. So either you stay undercover or you leave. Right. Yeah. And so, and of course, there's so much red pill these days that a lot of mosque imams, etc., in religious spaces will rant about that. And then a person who is, gay, lesbian, etc., might just leave that place because of the constant triggering, right? And create new spaces. So then we had Masjid Rabia, and we've had, Al-Fatiha, etc. Here, there's others places as well. There is that. It just seems that there is a pushing out.
And I think the navigating differences thing, I mean, we can't underestimate, I think, the amount of social media controversy that every WhatsApp I was on had a controversy about this all over social media. And I think it became this way that people would see, oh, this person, I think for a lot of queer Muslims, it was like, oh, okay, so that's what you think. That's who you agree with. Okay, I guess I'm not welcome here. Even the kind of code of silence that allowed them to enter the spaces was kind of broken, where it was like, before it was like, oh, I could go and kind of assume everyone is giving everyone the benefit of the doubt. Now that's broken. Now I know that X, Y, and Z person is against me or doesn't think I belong in this space.
If I just flip that, just on the other side, thinking, I mean, from the perspective of imams who find it difficult, I think their argument would be something like, well, the alcoholic that comes into the mosque, he is not demanding for you to accept him and be fine and normalize his drinking in that sense. What they would find difficult is that when people have with alternative sexualities, they're actually asking for too much that we cannot, for them, the faith cannot give that. Yes, we can offer respect, empathy, and care, but when you demand that we want to be accepted for who we are and we want this mosque space, I think that's the challenge. So
let's say Mr. X in the mosque disagrees with people of alternate sexualities, doesn't want to encourage it, and doesn't want to accept that standpoint. What can he, let's say he in this case, Mr. X, do to not necessarily accept that aspect of this individual, yet not drive them away and allow them this space in God's house, if you like?
Yeah, I think that's the difficult part. Again, I would probably bring this argument back that that person can find spaces outside the mosque. I had just a quick interesting example. There's an LGBTQ chaplain in Edinburgh University. She sent me an email saying there was a Muslim guy who explored his sexuality, but in the course of that, he lost his wife, his family, his business. He couldn't control himself. Obviously, he contracted HIV. He's going through that process, but now he needs his religion, and he can't go to mosques for Jummah. Can he come to Harriet? And I said, yeah, it's an open university space. If he feels comfortable, he can pray there. You know, no one's going to judge him, and no one's going to know him. So maybe those outer spaces, again, maybe we're asking too much from the mosque, where there, again, these other spaces that we talked about before in our previous podcast, perhaps are those spaces for these people to find spirituality.
I feel like the demand for acceptance and the demand to say, are you on our side or not? Do you accept? Like that is more of a political, that's a state and a broader cultural and also very much colored by Islamophobia, kind of like pin you down, like which one are you, like pick. But I don't feel like anybody coming into the mosque is like saying, can you sign your name to my sexuality or something, right? It's not really like that difficult, because it's true. We engage with all kinds of people. Like we pray right next to a guy who works with the weapons industry. We pray right next to CIA people, like a famous mosques, thinking of North America, right? And they're fine. They're very well respected members of the community. They're literally contributing to the deaths of our community members, our people, right? And that's not a problem. But this sort of I feel like what you're talking about in terms of the sort of the pinning people down, the identities, because the fiqh isn't really talking about identity, is it? It's talking about an act. And so that doesn't actually jibe with a life that is queer. It's a very different fiqh. It's not really addressing. And I think I was going to address that thing of like born this way, right? And then I was like afraid, am I allowed to talk about that? But yeah, I am curious to know how people address that, because for me, as somebody who was an immigrant from Pakistan and like, coming in my 20s, and like that was the big shift for me.
So I was talking to some scholars yesterday over the workshop that we had, and they were, there's no scientific evidence. They were looking for the gay gene. That's what they called it. There's no scientific evidence that you're born this way. So okay, but as a social scientist, my participants have told me that I'm suicidal. I've lost my parents, lost my family, and this many years on, they told me, Muhammad, if I could press a button and rewind all of that and not be the way I am, I would do it. So I don't think it was a she in there. Like, she is making a choice here and say, you know what, I feel like being gay. It's not that simple. So whether we say it's nurture or nature, it's certainly not a choice of this individual that they want to lose their family and their parents and all the social structures they built around them.
I think we have to again kind of zoom out a little bit and see, is the structure of the conversation that we're having, does it mimic these broader structures? Like we talk about moral panics, right? In the social sciences, right? Where we have a basically historically privileged group saying, no, we're the oppressed ones now. We're the ones who can't practice what we want, right? Like, and there's this kind of like specter, right? There's this like Gaga figure that's coming and I think in Muslim communities we're having a moral panic about this, right? We there's this kind of a straw man image of like the gays are at the door, knocking down the masjid like walls, and I'm like, are they though?
And the same is being done regarding women, and I actually have noticed this more in Britain than in the US. By the way, the women are coming for us. They are taking alimony. They're like, oh my God, the women are just so terrifying when you hear like British Muslims very often, not all of course, but like many of them are really have created this idea and have like positioned themselves as like the resistance against that. And I really want to also address the besieged masculinity idea that we're the last defenders of like poor men, and really do you need to be, right? And so
I mean, I had a sister who was very close to me, who I love and respect dearly, say to me, if I said publicly I want to raise my daughter as according to the sex she was assigned at birth, I would lose my job, and I was like, but you are raising her according to she wears dresses, you call her she, nobody says anything against that. Like, so where's this, where's the fear coming from? I think that's the question we have to ask ourselves. But I think it's also fair to take. I agree. I think that analytical question of the alcoholic identity versus action, I think that's fair to think about. I also think it is important to think about the fact that we have our Muslim spaces are structured around cisgender. So we've been talking about sexuality a lot. For people who are non-binary, right? Where do you pray in the masjid? I think there are real questions that or do open up a bigger kind of potential can of worms that I think perhaps our community is not quite ready to deal with. But I think that we have to kind of slow down, again, feel confident in our religion and allow these things to emerge organically, rather than try to kind of double down on positions the way the Navigating Differences statement does. Like, we need to be solving these problems locally, organically, with empathy, creatively, and together, right? Rather than sectioning off parts of the Muslim community as, Muslim, not Muslim, acceptable, not acceptable, westernized, traditional, that's the only way.
One thing I would like to say, in particular, this idea of gender neutrality is something I personally have struggled to deal with. But the counseling space is quite interesting, because when I started my counseling journey and working with clients, I was openly asked, are you uncomfortable with working with particular type of clients? And I openly said to him, I'm okay with working with the L and the G and the B, but I still haven't figured out the transgender. And I don't know if I'll be able to show a level of empathy and acceptance with that. And they were okay with that. They're like, we're not going to give you any clients who are from the transgender community. And I found that quite liberating, because it's a counseling space, but they're honestly asking you, can you be empathetic to that community? And I said, I haven't figured that out myself yet, so I'm not ready to work with that community.
That's really funny, if I probe you on a personal front, if you don't mind, because Islamically speaking, I would think that from the LGBTQ, etc., the T would be, fiqhi speaking, the least problematic, rather than the L and the G and the B would be more problematic. So, I don't know how you found the T part more of a challenge rather than the first.
The neutrality or the... But also not to put you on the spot.
No, of course. Yeah. I suppose the thing is through my traditional training and this idea of essentialism and nominalism that comes into, and I don't know if it's a good thing, but I'm firmly kind of rooted in that, and so I haven't processed that myself yet. How do I and especially where you look at slight traditional positions where they say that being non-binary is from the sifat of Allah.
Yeah.
Okay, so how do this is an Aqidah position, so like male, female, if non-binary it's Allah's. So I don't know, I need to have conversations with people, with sociologists and counselors. So this has been really
useful for me, having those friends, right? Having friends who are transgender, having friends who are non-binary, and really just spending time with them. My husband and I, we talk about this, and I think he's like, I'm still figuring it out. So I wonder if that is a more of a masculine position where you are kind of positioned in patriarchy, but I don't know. Who knows?
But I think going back to a really great point earlier about ambiguity, right? Like, I think being able, and it's funny because we were joking about like who's going to get in trouble for this podcast, and I'm like, I could easily get in trouble from the Muslims or from the queers, like, or from the Muslim queers who are like, you're not taking a strong enough stance, like you're being too.
That's what I've been.
You're letting be too sort of like, and I think, and this is, people are welcome to. I want to have. I want to be in a space of disagreement. I think this goes back to your beautiful point earlier about maybe not having state power gives us room, right? Because in a sense, like, yes, I understand in a context, I think that these social movements have developed in a context of fighting for rights under the context of the modern nation state. And sometimes we carry that out into spaces that are not appropriate. It's not appropriate to use the same framework, right? Yes, if we're dealing with the state and who has a right to healthcare and who has a right to see their partner, to me, it's okay to be like, no, there's right, there's wrong, and there's nothing, But if we're talking about a community, a voluntary community, like a religious community, I think we have to, on both sides, be able to say, I disagree with you, and that's okay. Like, I disagree with you, and that's okay. Like, in part because we don't know. I mean, the way that I was taught Islamic law is like, the Sharia is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala dictates to us. Fiqh is our attempt to figure it out, right? And so all fiqh is necessarily flawed and temporary, and so we don't know. And that's what I want from people. That's what I want from people, is also an acknowledgement that at the end of the day, you don't know. Just like I always say, I have a heterodox position on this. I know it's heterodox because it's in the minority. I understand that. I'm very comfortable being heterodox. And I don't know. And I don't know. But at the end of the day, I think we all have to live with whatever way of being in the world that, like, I think I can face Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saying, listen, I thought a lot about it. This was my reality. You saw me try, right? You saw my reality, and these are the conclusions I came to.
This is, I mean, literally how I feel. And I, in the 90s, before that, I had a strong sense of certainty, right? Or as a adolescent and post-adolescent, I needed to stand by a strong sense of certainty, because who am I going to be? I don't know. And is it going to be wrong? So I really needed to stick by that. And then later, I became more comfortable with saying, I felt like Allah led me into that position where I just had to make a decision without very clear evidence to say, okay, I'm going to do this, and Allah make it okay, or forgive me if I'm wrong, I mean, very often, I feel the same way, and I feel that, I guess we'll find out.
Yeah. I mean, I would like to add two things. One was from the presentation yesterday that really hit me, was that queer people need Islam or need faith. And that changed perspective. I mean, how do I understand that? How do I begin to understand that? And I know for me it's a blind spot. So I actually reached out to a Muslim counselor who identifies being queer and who's strictly dealing with the Muslim community in Glasgow who have issues about their own gender. And he said to me, Hassan, you don't understand. It's a big issue. There's men with beards out there who are questioning their gender. And I thought, wow, this is very interesting. And so he helps me to understand, just to process that perhaps I'm not ready yet to confront myself, but he's that kind of buffer there telling me that there's a big issue, this is what I'm dealing with, and it's challenging me.
I love that you have that space.
Yes. Yeah. And that you can say, with which you're approaching
I'm not
this.
Sure. I'm uncomfortable, right? So many of us do not have that kind of space to do that, or to say to employers or whoever that I'm still figuring it out. I don't know if I'm ready to unlearn things, etc. But the CVE prevent type frameworks make it impossible to do that.
And I will say, whether it's women being pushed out of the Muslim community or if it's queer people being pushed out of the community, and I'm around both groups a lot. Yes, people need faith, in part because I think that people on the other side think that, these people will just blend into American or British society because that's where they really belong. Yeah. They know they're still Muslim brown people. There's nowhere else to go. I think when I talk to women who have been pushed out of Muslim communities, there's such grief. Yeah. There's such grief because it's not like you enter the rest of the society and that society is like, here, come home. No, that society is sitting here talking badly about your family, your loved ones, why are Muslim women often, even though we're so mad at Muslim men, we're so protective of them because we're like, we get to criticize them, but don't you dare talk about my brother.
We need to record this.
Yeah, I'm like, so many of us are like this, actually. No, I mean, literally, I once left a therapist because she said, I complained about something with my brother, and she said, well, my understanding is Muslim men are like this. I'm like, how dare you? I was like, absolutely not, But I think, and queer folks too, they enter into, queer Muslim folks find themselves in an Islamophobic world in which the people they love, the communities they care about are being, meanwhile, those communities don't want them. And so they're in this kind of okay. And then they've been robbed of the spiritual resources to deal with this in a world that is so, my God, I can't think of a moment where we needed God. I mean, of course, we always needed God, but I don't know how I could have lived through this genocide of my people if I couldn't read Surah Yasin for our shuhada, on a regular basis. I don't know how I could have survived. So I think we have to think very carefully about what is the spiritual responsibility of closing the door to God, to someone. I wouldn't want to face God having done that.
Yeah. I mean, this is how I feel. Like, even if there is a moment of uncertainty, because of course the fiqh is it's not really queer friendly, right? But like at the end of the day, I have to face Allah with the responsibility of how I treated people. Not was I right on this or not, right? I have to do my best with that.
Well, I think on those notes, of which altogether the last few comments I think have really reflected a sense of humility within all of us, and how we have to treat other people, and also how we have to look at our own perspectives. Maybe that's a starting point in answering some of the questions of the challenges that the Muslim community is facing. So again, I thank our viewers and listeners for joining us for this second podcast in the series of 3, and we hope that they join us again in the next one, where we'll be talking about another very sensitive issue, which is to do with abuse in Muslim societies.